Hi, I'm Peter Roper. This is another serving of Potluck Politics. Many of you don't know there's a Democratic primary for Connecticut Secretary of the State and also Treasurer on August 9th. Today we are lucky to have the two Democratic candidates for Secretary of the State, a hugely important job. You as a Democratic voter have the power to pick the best candidate for this job. Secretary of the State does many things, but most significantly oversees voting and elections. Voting is democracy and more American than apple pie. Stephanie Thomas is the endorsed Democratic nominee. She has been a small business owner and currently serves as a state legislator from Norwalk, Wilton, and Westport area. Maritza is the Democratic challenger and currently Director of Health for the City of New Haven. Thank you both very much for taking the time from your hectic schedules to talk to our audience. We have lots to cover, so brief and to the point will be appreciated. So Stephanie, starting out, how does your work experience uniquely prepare you for this job, being a small business person and legislative?
Sure, thank you for having us here today. So my background is a bit unique in that I've worked for over 30 years in the nonprofit sector, also as a fundraising consultant for 26 years, and I currently own my own business and serve as a state rep. So my background, I believe in nonprofit and small business, you learn how to solve problems on a shoestring, and you can't wait for the perfect solution. You have to solve problems right away. And starting my own business, I think like an entrepreneur, come up with creative solutions, and no is never an option. And then obviously as a state legislature, I'm very familiar with how laws are made. I've made relationships in Hartford, and I've spent the last year and a half vice chairing our elections committee.
Great, thank you. So Maritza, how does your work experience running a large agency with a big budget apply to the Secretary of State project?
Peter, thank you for having this show this afternoon. I'm really grateful to be here and to be back in a town where I served for a decade. I've been in public service for 2 decades now, really addressing an array of issues that impact the community. I was right here fighting against our democracy, against our hospital merger when the workers were being, positions were being consolidated and health services were lacking, and also promoting future healthcare workforce for individuals and future generations. For the last 6 years, I've been devoted to government management, executive management in 2 large cities, and have been really been able to, through the response of this pandemic and as an official commander, saw firsthand a lot of the infrastructure support that is desperately needed for local registrars and town clerks, as I had to reopen our polling stations and also our small businesses. I had to license our businesses and help reopen our businesses in our city, and saw firsthand how they struggled, and they really are the backbone of our state. So my vision is to be able to transfer my government executive management skills and an implementer of policies, along with managing over 100 employees and also a budget similar to the Secretary of the State's office, really be able to roll up my sleeves on day one and be able to carry out the duties and mission of the office, which is access around voting, integrity around of the office and the process, as well as supporting access to business services.
Great. Now you're going to have to catch your breath, but do you have any firsthand experience with registering voters or running an election, and are you a member of the League of Women Voters?
Yeah, so over the last years, I've been a voter myself. I have supported the process and supported a number of individuals that were running for office. I've never myself considered myself a candidate, but one thing is for certain, that when I had to reopen our polling stations and saw firsthand the process in itself and having to navigate that in the midst of this new COVID era is what's really motivated me to run for Secretary of the State.
Stephanie, do you have first-hand experience registering voters or running election? And are you a member of the League of Voters?
Yes, yes, and yes. Definitely from college onward, I always volunteered with groups like New York PIRG, etc., going to festivals, helping to register voters. Once I moved to Connecticut, I had also started my own business at the same time. But after the 2016 presidential election, I got a lot more involved locally. And that's where I started volunteering for Chris Murphy's Fight Back, where I was training people to canvass and go door to door and talk about what the Democratic Party was doing. I started volunteering at polling places every election day. I'm that volunteer who always signed up to do the entire 14 hours, and I would just go home for a lunch break. I also belong to many advocacy groups. In my district, I have 3 leagues, so I belong to all 3. But even before I was elected, we also have some local advocacy groups that deal with voter access. And many of us have been advocating for the last many years for early voting and no excuse absentee voting. And we have weekly meetings, so I've been participating in those. And then obviously, again, I vice chair our elections committee in the legislature, where for the last year and a half, that's all I do, advocate for all things voting related.
Great. So a quick breath, and Connecticut is considered progressive, but our election laws are pretty restrictive, relatively speaking. What do you plan to focus on when you get into office?
Sure. We passed a lot of laws last year. A lot of people don't know. So obviously we have the constitutional amendment, which will be on the ballot in November. We're a little further down the field with no excuse absentee voting. We did expand the reasons by which people can vote by absentee, and that took effect this summer. We passed automatic voter registration last year, also restoring voting rights for parolees. We also introduced a study and will be implementing risk limiting audits. So all of those things have to get rolled out. My focus for the next year or two is to make sure that we can roll out all that policy with excellence and make sure that all 169 towns have the resources and the training to do so. And I think, the state needs to invest in that outcome.
Maritza, same question. Connecticut is fairly progressive, but some restrictions apply. What do you plan to focus on if you get to be elected?
Absolutely. And I think I agree around the policy issues that were just described that have just been a priority for legislators. I think both of us on this platform agree with the policy issues. We are well overdue with early voting and expansion of no absentee ballots. It is time that we really bring access to the people and really figure out a way that we can better get voter turnout in our communities. For me, as Secretary of the State, the job is to ensure that we're implementing that policy as well as educating individuals around the fact that it's going to be on the ballot, and then also ensuring that individuals impacted by this policy, which is local registrars and town clerks, depending on the policy we're talking about, early voting, as such, as well as legislators, need to be at the table. So my vision is to ensure that we create a work group that's going to be comprised of those individuals, both from small towns, medium-sized cities, and large cities, to be able to ensure that we're implementing that policy. But first and foremost, we need to get it passed. We need to educate the voters. And then as the Secretary of the State, we need to make sure that the process for implementation is going to be equitable across Connecticut.
Great. I don't think I heard drop boxes from either of you. Dropbox is likely to be expanded or
I doubt they'll be
at least
expanded, but they still exist.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I'm in full
allowed.
support of that.
Yeah.
I'm in full
Great.
support.
Thank you. Okay, Maritza, how will you get more people to participate in voting process?
So I think one of the things, as you know, there's a lot of grassroots organizations doing this work, and so I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge those grassroots organizations trying to ensure that people get registered to vote. That is just one aspect of the job, however. It's important for us to be able to also message and educate the community. The Secretary of the State currently had a advisory group that really worked on civic engagement. There was an entire branch. I want to expand that branch on civic engagement because we need to ensure that we're utilizing education, and also as the Secretary of the State, as a leader, being able to convene those grassroots organizations so that we're all consistent with messaging across the state, and ensuring that the education piece is really going to be heightened to really improve voter turnout, as well as improving the process for our voters. I think lastly, I want to say that for the process as Secretary of the State, we want to make sure that we have standardized operating procedures for those that are going to be doing the work, our local registrars and town clerks. And listen, state statutes are the state statutes. They do not change because we're in a small town or a medium-sized city or a large city. So we need to really standardize our laws and making sure that people understand their voting rights, along with improving the process by modernizing the systems, as well as ensuring that they have the proper resources to do that job. And lastly, as I close, that is why I am advocating for fiscal autonomy for the office, because in order to improve process, we need to be able to have the infrastructure and resources to do that work.
Great.
Peter, could you repeat the question?
Sure. How will you get more people to participate in the voting process?
Yes, that is exactly why I'm running for this office to begin with. I believe civic education, civic engagement are the missing pieces of our representative form of democracy. We always talk about voter access and voter registration, but we never talk about how to educate people how to get involved every day other than on election day. So obviously the budget will be set for 2023, so I've been trying to brainstorm some low cost ways to get people involved right away. One thing I've talked about is standing up a YouTube channel where, you know, people can just search how to fill out that absentee ballot envelope that is very confusing in multiple languages. Getting out toolkits to neighborhood groups, congregations, nonprofits that explain not only how to register to vote, but also the other parts of our system, how to testify, what you can find if you go to cga.ct.gov. There's so much information out there and people just don't know how to access it. I will also, a great idea came up in brainstorming with a volunteer of mine saying, why can't people opt into a notification system where we would just send out an e-blast saying, there's an election coming up next week, or, you know, this is happening next month. But we as a country, I think, have always just taught people the civic responsibility is to vote. But I just keep saying as much as I can that that is only one day a year, and it takes a lot more than that to move policy forward. And I think it's why we see such a slow pace of change and why our policy doesn't always reflect the values of the people. So I am 100% committed to making sure people understand how to make their voice heard and giving them the tools to do it.
Quick follow-up, I didn't hear you mention young people. I'm really concerned about young people getting involved early, because once you get involved, you tend to stay involved. And the league does a lot, but any quick thoughts from either of you?
So for me, I kicked off this campaign with my two young adult sons, 24 and 19-year-old, because they are our future generation. And it was really critical for me to do that and teach them about the importance of their voices being heard through their voting process, because I didn't have that opportunity in the school system that I was brought up. Civic engagement was not a priority, or education, so I didn't understand the process until I became an executive through the nonprofit sector and had to advocate for a number of legislative bills in order to address the community and issues that they were facing, both at the federal and state level. So for certain, this platform is a priority for our youth, because really they are our future.
Yeah, obviously curriculum is the best fix, but that's a long-term problem that would have to go through the State Department of Education, and we can't just add curriculum and hours without making other changes in other curriculum. So Denise Merrill, Secretary Merrill, who has endorsed me, which I'm very proud of, has stood up a lot of programs that are good for kids, like the Red, White, and Blue School program. Obviously, we have the Kid Governor program. So I think giving greater visibility to the programs that already exist will be a very quick thing we can do. But what I've tried to do just as a legislator is try to make sure young people understand the clear correlation between the social change that they want to see and how to engage in the process. So I think they need the same education that adults do, because I've seen my colleagues think about an issue differently or vote one way or another if they just hear from people. We get so many bills, people don't realize, like in a standard session year, we have 3,000 to 4,000 bills that we receive. So if no one's actively lobbying for it, it might slip under the radar. So if we can get kids to understand that if you want that climate change bill passed, write your state rep, write your state senator, because if they hear from even 50 people, that will make them pull that bill out and look at it differently. So that's the type of education and message that I would like to get out there.
Great. Stephanie, how concerned are you about election fraud and how will you prevent it? And actually, I have a note here for myself about election security as well, because that's part of the prevention of fraud, I guess.
You know, honestly, in my opinion, the greatest election fraud is what we know now as the big lie. Mm-hmm. Now that we've just concluded the January 6th hearings and, you know, in Liz Cheney's closing statement, there was that recording, I think, from Steve Bannon talking about, I know, Trump is just going to say he won and people will believe it. To me, that's election fraud. What most people call election fraud, I actually call human mistakes. There are cases where, I know in my own district, I remember I was talking to an elderly couple and the wife was so happy. She's like, oh, and I saved you a stamp. We put both absentee ballots in the same envelope. And I'm like, ma'am, that's illegal. Your vote won't count. That's a mistake. It's not fraud. I know people get very confused. I know people who have said, I don't remember what town I registered in because I moved last year. So all of these things are about process, systems, making sure that people understand how not to commit mistakes and making sure town clerks, registrars have the resources to implement. There was one thing that came up earlier that I do disagree with, which is although the statutes are the same, the way the law is applied does vary, whether you're a small town, medium size, or large. By way of example, let's take absentee ballots. There are clerks in some towns who don't have an office and don't have a secure location in which to store absentee ballots. And then you take a place like Stamford, who received so many absentee ballots, they had to take over other offices so that those ballots could be stored securely. So we, as in the Secretary's office, really do have to think about how that law can be implemented equally across all towns.
Thank you. Maritza, how concerned are you about election fraud and how will you prevent it? And election security also.
Listen, this is something that I just called out our Republican opponents today, just on Twitter, because it is a typical Republican playbook that's really played out. The fact that they're utilizing different mechanisms saying that we are having voter fraud is really shameful and really oppressing to many different communities. And the fact is that it's not happening. Nevertheless, when we are in government, we have to have transparency. And so we want to make sure that if there are any concerns, that we do investigate them. And that is a responsibility within the Secretary of State's office. But it's important for us to stress the process. And that's why it goes back to your earlier question regarding the voter process. And we have to make sure that it is easily displayed and that is visible for those voters that are coming in, whether they are a Democrat, an independent, or a Republican. Because when the process is clear across the state, then there's no question about whether there's voter fraud. And we really need to really step up and be able to, from the Secretary of State's office, message so that we're addressing and combating the misinformation that continues to be out there. because now it is in our backyard, like Republican opponents like Terri Wood, who's talking about that very issue today on her Twitter page.
Okay, Maritza, you'll need a Deputy Secretary of the State. Do you have anyone in mind? And would you consider offering the job to your opponent?
You know, running for Secretary of the State is similar in size to the office that I run currently. And my motto is that we are only as strong as our team. And for me, making sure that we have individuals that have the skill set, commitment, and passion to carry out the mission with excellence is critical and vital. For me to be premature and start indicating who should serve in that role would not be an ethical thing for me to say at this juncture, but nevertheless, it is important for us to be thinking through the skill sets, what it takes for individuals to carry out the job, especially in the deputy position, because it's really responsible for a lot of the operations of the office. And it's important that the workforce is going to be supported. As you know, the Secretary of the State's office is comprised of many unionized positions, which takes a lot of relationships. And I am happy to be endorsed by organized labor, and knowing that that relationship needs to be complemented between the Secretary of the State and the deputy.
Thank you.
And I agree.
Stephanie, same question.
I agree with most of that. I certainly would not be putting the cart before the horse. We both have, or one of us will have 2 elections before we have to think about hiring staff. And I'm sure Maritza would agree, although we spend so much time doing this together, you know, going to meet and greets, but all of our answers are usually contained to 1 to 2 minute sound bites. So we don't know each other that well. You know, we hear the same questions, the same answers, etc. But when it comes time to appoint a deputy, to me, everybody's on the table. I would be looking for someone that complements my skill sets. Obviously, equity is really important to me. Gender is really important to me. But at the end of the day, there's a job that has to get done. And I always say, I promise excellence, not perfection. So I'm going to be looking for someone who has that same mindset.
Great. Okay, now, Stephanie, you can comment on the Republican campaign to undermine elections all over the country, and especially in the swing states. This is pretty open-ended, but it needs to be discussed.
What's the question?
Republican campaign to undermine elections all over the country, especially in swing states?
You know, there are a lot of campaigns going on by both parties, right? But Republicans have been pushing certain narratives in a very coordinated way. The one that I happen to feel is most disturbing at this time is the ISL theory, the independent state legislature theory. Many states have already introduced bills around it. Connecticut introduced a bill around it, but it never moved out of committee, which would basically allow state legislatures, instead of secretaries of the state, to be the final arbiters of, you know, any election decisions, certifying elections. And those decisions would supersede any court rulings. I find that to be a very troubling notion, and the Republicans have based it on a certain interpretation of the Constitution. And there is a case regarding this on the docket in the Supreme Court this fall, which I also find very disturbing. So I always tell people, by the time you read about something in the newspaper, it's too late. So I would say, if you love the American style of democracy that you've been practicing for the last couple of decades, look into this theory, start writing people about it now, because I think it's very dangerous.
Maritza, same question. Comment on the Republican campaign to undermine elections all over the country, especially in swing states.
You know, it is unfortunate what's happening across the country, and it's a testament to the reason why we really need to maintain our state blue, so that we can protect our democracy. As Secretary of the State, I will make it a priority to ensure that I will fight for our democracy and ensure that we are not having our process undermined by examples that I have given already in regards to protecting and also being transparent and ensuring that we are really educating the public. It is really critical, to just be frank, is that a lot of lay people don't even know that this is happening. And I agree with my opponent where by the time it hits a newspaper, it is too late. And so it's really important for us to ensure that we have a strong Democrat in office to roll up our sleeves and be able to do this work on day one, because we are under attack. And based on, our Republican opponents, it is evident that they're trying to compromise our process here, and it will really take us even steps backwards. And so we really need to make sure that this coming primary, we vote for the candidate that can be able to do the work on day one.
Following up on that, how optimistic are you about our democracy and the future of democracy?
I feel I'm always an optimist. I feel that there's an opportunity for us to figure out a mechanism to really have voter engagement and people be part of a process. But we have a lot of work to do around education, around in the processes, because we cannot push policies from the top down. It hasn't worked. It's been over a decade in trying to pass early voting. So we have to make sure that we're educating the public and really thinking through literacy, multilingual and multicultural, because we live in a diverse state. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at that aspect of the office. And I would be remiss if we do not mention the business services of that office, which we haven't even talked about today. Our small businesses struggled in the midst of the pandemic. They are in the process of now trying to revitalize their businesses, and we need to make sure that access to business services, coupled with protecting our democracy, are going to be at the forefront of the Secretary of the State's office.
Thank you. Stephanie, how optimistic are you?
Sure.
I assume you're both pretty optimistic because you're running for this job.
Yeah, and I do want to give a nod to the businesses. Good call. It's a big part of the job, and I have a lot of great ideas about how we can help businesses through the Secretary's office. But about optimism, one thing I often say is you can't force people to vote. You have to inspire them. And I feel certain that if we bring time and attention and repetition to this notion that every single person matters, their voice counts, and we teach them how to make it count, I believe they will thank us for it, and it might bring a little more hope and joy to them as well. Because right now, I know I speak to many people who just feel like, why isn't this working? Why does nothing I do matter? And I want to make sure it matters. So I'm hopeful that should I be elected Secretary of the State, that I can bring that inspiration to all of our residents, and in turn, they will feel the hope that I feel by running it for this office.
Great. Congratulations. We have the bonus question now, which you don't know about. These days, the Secretary of the State can make all the difference in the outcome of an election. Could you stand up to 60 minutes of pressure from the President of the United States to change Connecticut's vote count if it came to that?
Who's first?
You are.
Is that me?
Yes.
Yes, that's why I'm running for the office. Funny true story, when I was discussing it with my husband, like, oh, I'm thinking about this. He's like, oh my gosh, this is great. I can imagine a showdown with you and Donald Trump. This would be amazing. I'm a very quiet person. I'm very deliberative. I'm very thoughtful. And people mistake and I laugh a lot. I believe humor is the best way to get through many things. And people mistake that for, pushover. I have worked as a consultant for a long time where people often feel that their way is the right way, and I have to find a way to push back. I'm never rude, I'm never impolite, but I am specific and I am firm, and I would look forward to a call from our former president.
Maritza, you seem small but tough, so you can answer the same question quickly. We're running out of time.
Listen, I had to respond to a pandemic where we didn't have it for 100 years, and I had to combat a lot of misinformation, particularly from the Republican side. So I have fought this fight. I showed that government can be trusted in the midst of crisis. I am the only candidate with government executive management experience and truly ready to do this job. And it is, so if I get that call, I have stood up for the fight for the people then, and now I will do it as well as an elected official for Secretary of the State.
Thank you both, Stephanie Thomas, Maritza Bond. I really appreciate it. It's been entertaining and informative. We're glad that you serve and are willing to run. It's a big deal, as you know. Thank you to SEC TV and the staff for making Community Access TV happen. Thank you to the viewers. Spread the word and tell your friends to tune in. This program will also be available on YouTube. Vote every chance you get. Democracy depends on us. Be well.